Okay, welcome to the live podcast, Win More on Purpose. Today we have Michal Eisik with us on managing clients, how to handle uncomfortable client situations in a way that leaves everyone a winner. The agenda, for those who don't know, it's going to be more conversational. We're here learning together. Write down those questions. There's going to be a Q&A at the end, and there will be a recording for those who, for whatever reason, have to leave early. Please, just to start off, everyone can put into the chat, what are you focusing on now in your business? Where are you coming in from today? Just, to get us warmed up. For those who don't know me, my name is Jakob Steinberg. I am a sales coach that when I first started about 4+ years ago now, in the coaching space, I realized people were able to build 6-7 figure businesses on their own. They're good at what they do. They're passionate. Some put along the way, they get stuck, whether it's because sales is a bit of a dirty word. It's very often associated with a used car salesperson. They just hit that glass ceiling, difficult to get past it. And ultimately, it's where I came into the picture: mindset, techniques, skills, really helping them to take things to the next level and just take their business to a whole new place, getting confidence and clarity in how to talk to new clients as well as follow up with potentials. And I've had the pleasure of helping quite a number of people that are pretty well known on LinkedIn, whether it's Chai Fishman, Hoodie Bluch, Hoodie Greenberger. And the clients that have been able to work with me at the 6-7 figure realm have been able to grow by even 50% in the first 60 days of working with me. Those at the 100K level have been able to grow by even 150% in the first 60 to 90 days. And solopreneurs have even been able to grow by 200, 240% in 45 days. Without further ado, Michal, tell us a little bit about yourself. Love to hear.
Hey, happy to be here. So I am the CEO and founder of Michal Eisik Media, which is a boutique copywriting agency that specializes in website copy for tech companies. And in addition to that, I run Copy Tribe, which is an intensive online cohort-based mentorship program for copywriters. It certifies copywriters over 7 intense months. That is my flagship program. And I also offer lots of other smaller courses and products for copywriters and freelancers, including a course called Profitable Freelancer, from which a lot of the points we're going to talk about today about client management are pulled like directly from a lot of that content. So you'll get a nice sneak peek at what some of my Profitable Freelancer members have learned about. So really excited to be here today. And I'd love to also, just my personal request, if you can put in the chat where you're located and what you do, like just to get a sense of who I'm talking to, that would be super valuable.
Fantastic. Definitely love the added level of what everyone does. Let's get into this. Like, this is a very big conversation for people, whether they are freelancers, especially, but even when they're a small to medium-sized business. I think a lot of people, they get very uncomfortable in an uncomfortable situation, and they kind of forget what their role is within that situation. Before we go and delve into that piece of it, though, what are some of the early warning signs that a client relationship might be heading towards some challenging territory, and how can we be proactive before it ends up in an uncomfortable situation?
So I like to bucket red flags into 4 categories. Most client red flags fall into one of these 4 buckets. The first is being unresponsive. So a client who during the sales process suddenly goes AWOL or ghosts you for a month without any kind of communication, or you say, that sounds like an interesting project. Can you send me some of the materials, the relevant materials, so I can better scope it out? And then they just don't send the materials. Or you schedule meetings and they don't show up. So a client who's unresponsive or frequently misses meetings, calls, that's one category of red flags. The next category would be urgency. I'm sure all of you can relate to this. There are some clients, everything is due yesterday and everything is an emergency and everything is a rush. So they need it done tomorrow. Now, once in a while, people have a legitimate rush job. But if there's a client who every time they approach you needs something done yesterday, that's another red flag. That's a sign that it's going to be really difficult and unpleasant to work with them. The next category is platitudes, and I'm sure a lot of you can relate to this as well. So when I say platitudes, I mean clients who say things like, well, I can offer you $1,000 for this project, even though you would normally charge more. But if it goes well, there's a lot of future work for you. So promises of future work in exchange for getting a really low price on today's work. Or they'll promise things like referrals. If you do a great job, I have a really large network. If you do a great job, you'll be able to have an awesome piece in your portfolio. Or they try to minimize the complexity and the scope of the job, and they approach you and they say, I have a quick, small job for you. And then when you hear about the details, you're like, that's not quick and that's not small. So all of those I put in that category of platitudes. Now, the last category is a little bit more subtle and nuanced, but in a way is the most dangerous. And the category I call that is untrusting. A client who doesn't really trust your expertise. They don't see you as an expert, and they're likely going to give you a lot of orders and not trust your strategy at any point along the way. So they might approach you and they might talk about how they have a lot of experience doing XYZ and they know all about it. They're just hiring you because they don't have any time. So in other words, they're the experts, but they just need someone to follow orders. And they might talk about their abilities. They might question a lot of what you're saying and just convey a very untrusting vibe. And that can make for a very difficult experience because unless you're prepared to be an order taker, your client is not going to really be happy with anything you do. They're going to second guess everything and maybe even just tell you to revise it all over again in the manner that they'd like. So I'd say that those are the 4 categories of red flags, but this is really important. A lot of clients show up with one of these. Many clients will show up with 1 or 2 of them, and that could be okay. It's really important to evaluate, to look at the big picture and say, are there 7 red flags here? Or is there 1 red flag that's really frequent and really intense? In therapy, they evaluate the severity of a problem with FID, frequency, intensity, and duration. So I say you can also evaluate red flags like that. It's okay if you have 1 or 2 of them, but if it's constant, consistent, or really intense, that's when you want to take a step back and ask yourself, do I really want to move forward?
I think it's an amazing point that you bring out, especially in the fact that so many people they feel almost like they have to take every client that comes their way. And what they don't realize when they put themselves into that situation is they're going to end up with a lot of uncomfortable client situations when we do that, right? Because ultimately, not everyone is going to be a fit for you. And like you said, whether it's a trust factor and they want someone to just take orders, whether it's, you know, the famous idea that you're going to get lots of exposure for this, so that's perfect. My rent is 800 exposures, so that's exactly what I need, right? It doesn't work that way, right? So ultimately we need to be paying attention to the little details within the sales process to see what are the types of people that we're attracting or that are at least speaking to us, and then figure out where do we need to move left or right from there. um it brings me right into the next question, which is, one of the things that a lot of, especially the freelance world, want to be able to give over to their clients is a VIP service feel. But at the same time, a lot of these issues of uncomfortable situations come up when we're not maintaining the right boundaries. So, how do they give over that VIP service feel while also maintaining boundaries?
That's such a great question. Before I address it, I just want to go back to your other point. You spoke about how some of us feel like we have to accept every client. And I think there's 2 really important things to keep in mind over there. Number 1, if you have a good marketing system set up, then you should be getting enough leads, a steady enough generation of leads that you won't feel that pressure to take every client. If you don't have good marketing, then yes, you're going to feel compelled to take any client because you need to pay your bills or you need to pay your staff. So very often, if you're feeling pressured to accept a project, even when you're a little nervous about it, that may be a sign that something is not right with your marketing and you need to work more on that. That's one point. And the second point is that it's really important to keep in mind, and I myself have to remind myself of this a lot because I'm a natural yes sayer. I like saying yes to people. For every client you accept, you're going to have to turn another opportunity down. Your time is not limited. Your staff's time is not limited. So realize that when you accept mediocre client A, amazing client B is probably going to show up next week with a time-sensitive project, and you'll have to turn them down. So that's a cost-benefit analysis to make. You're not going to be able to do it all. So going back to your question about the VIP service. So I think most or many client management issues can be prevented with the right expectations by simply being super clear about what your clients can expect at every stage in the process. And that prevents so many misunderstandings, and that allows them not to be surprised and not to be disappointed. Now, in terms of making the client feel like a VIP, so one really easy tactic is simply to put a little bit more time and effort into your email or WhatsApp or messaging communication, however you communicate. Be a little extra warm, be friendly. If your client had some kind of special event recently or went on a vacation, ask them about it. Show interest in their life. If they posted something really great on social media, support them in that. So all those little touches to make them feel like you are really on their team and you want to see their success and you care about them, those things can make a big difference. So instead of keeping the email communication very dry and very technical, see where you can inject positivity, enthusiasm, and warmth. That's one tactic. Another tactic is to underpromise and overdeliver. We all know this, but it's good to remind ourselves about it from time to time. A simple example would be timeline. You promise your client you're going to deliver the product by Wednesday, deliver it Monday, deliver it 2 days early, and make them feel like, wow. A third tactic I like to recommend for this VIP feel is charging enough that you can throw in 1 or 2 extras and then make them feel great about it. So a complimentary add-on, whatever it is, the service that you offer, but baking something else into the project and then letting them know about that complimentary gift can really make them feel great.
I think that's absolutely fantastic advice. I'll tell you why. One of the things that we talk about from a sales perspective is staying in front of your potential client. Once they become a client, a lot of people forget about the idea that you really want to stay in front of that client in order to make sure that you're fostering an amazing relationship with them, because the relationship doesn't end once the sale is done. To the contrary, it now takes it to a new level of the relationship. And you really want to make sure that as you're going through that, you're continuing to be there, you're supporting them, whether that means that, they made a post on social media, you want to be there for them. You want to ask them how their holiday was. You want to ask them, the last time we spoke, this was going on. How's that going? And ultimately, when we do that within a client relationship, it's always about creating an experience for them that they're not expecting, right? When we can create an experience for them, like you're talking about here, giving them a complimentary add-on or going the extra, mile, being extra friendly, being, extra warm, whatever it is, what that does ultimately, I think at its core, and tell me if, maybe I'm misunderstanding, is it's creating an experience for them of that white glove service. This is what you get on the inside. And this is really why you chose to become a part of what it is that we do here. Is that right?
Absolutely. And I would add that for projects that draw out over several weeks or months, another great way to offer that white glove service is to be very communicative, over communicate. So once a week, send a detailed project update so they know that you're on top of things. Don't wait for them to ask for updates, to ask what's going on. Make them feel like you are on it.
Yeah. It's funny because I spoke to a client just recently about this exact idea. And they had been, waiting for clients to send them, ask them questions or things like that. And I was like, you can send updates on like even a monthly basis. You could even do it on a weekly basis or a bi-weekly basis and just blow them out of the water at how detailed you're going for them to really see not just the results aspect, but that we're really paying attention to everything you're doing. You can even automate that to a certain degree once you, get to that level. One of the things that you mentioned in your post actually on social media about the podcast was an uncomfortable situation and how do I know when it's a good time to get on a call versus use the written word? right? So when is, that piece for anyone who might not have seen that of an email versus a phone call?
So if you're listening to this and you've never had an uncomfortable situation with a client, then please teach me all your secrets. You are a unicorn, because it's really very common and we all face it at some point or another. And I'm a huge fan of the phone for uncomfortable, sticky, tensious situations. Yes, I made up that word, tensious. You really want to get on a call. It's much more human. There's a lot more room, not for body language, although you can have that a little bit with Zoom, but even a call without Zoom, just your voice, your vibe, everything about your energy leads to more empathy, more understanding. And it's uncomfortable, it's awkward. It can feel safer in the moment to hide behind an email or text than to spend 3 hours carefully wording your email and sweating over the different verbiage, but ultimately you're much better off with a call. So I would say calls are for situations that are uncomfortable or situations that require a little bit more back and forth. So brainstorming, ideation, collaboration about big picture stuff, or if a client has overarching concerns about a project, definitely a call. And email is more for more technical, granular, pointed things where you're trying to get very specific and very clear about more specific elements in a project and not fundamental concerns.
Fantastic. I speak about this with my own clients, and I mentioned it today in my post, where we talk about the 5 levels of communication. There's, the highest level is where you're in person. There's aura, there's energy, you have the body language, all the other cues. And then it moves down into a Zoom call where you can just see, right? You lose that energy that's in the room, but at least you have the visuals of the body language. We move down to phone call where at least I can hear. There's the hesitation in the voice, there's the way, the pitch, all the different, tonalities and the different things that they're going to give us there. And then we move into direct messaging, which at least is conversational. There might be an occasional voice note thrown in, and then it's email, which usually for most people, they see that as very blah, unless you're a copywriter and you're really, really good at keeping it conversational. But the higher up, especially for the sticky situations, I would say you want to have at least from number 3 and up. You want to be either a phone call or a Zoom. And usually you don't really need to get on a Zoom call unless it's like really bad and you really want to make sure they can see your visual and they can see, the empathy that you're having for them, not just hear it in your voice. But in general, a phone call is like that sweet spot. It's right in the middle. And it's where you can gain from both ends, where you're not in front of them from a Zoom perspective, but you're still not hiding behind that email. So there's enough communication going back and forth. So I think that's right on point, because from a communication perspective, there's so many miscommunications that can happen even further when you go email, especially when you see that things have gotten sticky. And if we, dig our feet in and say, no, I really want to stay in an email form, you might be, driving yourself farther and farther down the road where it's going to get, it can get really bad. So we definitely don't want to be doing that. So I think that's great.
Yeah, there's so much that gets lost in writing. I'm a copywriter, so I'm big on words, and yet words are very limited in many ways.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Another question that comes up for me when I think of, different aspects when it comes to client situations and, having uncomfortable or even, like you said, tensious situations or high tension, situations that might come up are, how do we get practical with it, right? What are your go-to strategies for when things get uncomfortable or high tension?
So my first strategy is empathize. Even if you think the client is in the wrong, or even if you think they're being unreasonable, the fact is they're feeling distress right now. And that's not something you want a client of yours to feel. So convey that. Show that you care and you're determined to discuss this and make it right and resolve it in the best way possible. And my second tip is, like I said, to get on a phone call as soon as possible and to communicate in a positive way, even when you're feeling very negative. Now, what do I mean by this? So I'll give an example. You have a client, you had a project, there was a certain scope, and the client approaches you and says, can you please do XYZ? And it's completely beyond the scope of what you agreed on. So your first instinct, how would a person normally reply? Sorry, I can't do that. It's not included in the project. That's where our mind goes as humans. But you can actually communicate that same exact thing from an entirely positive place. You can say, sure, I'd love to do that for you. That's an add-on, and that would cost XYZ. Are you interested in moving forward? And that way you are maintaining your boundaries and being clear, but it's coming from a place of warmth and from a place of, I really want to do this for you. This is how it could work.
Yeah, and it's really beautiful the way that you gave over, especially in that one sentence right there, right? Because ultimately, when it comes to any service, it's about the relationship, but it's also about the communication, the way we give things over. And it boils down to a lot of times the tone, a lot of times the way that we say things. And it, the biggest way is just like you just said, you can say the same thing in two different ways and you'll come out with two completely different feelings, right? You could say, yeah, I'd love to do that for you. That's an add on, right? There's just that comma there. That's an add on. This is how that works, as opposed to, I'd love to do that for you, but, right? The fact that you specifically didn't say it is everything, right? That one word is like one of the biggest pieces of that sentence that I think is important to point out for everyone listening, because that's the whole entire nuance of that sentence. It's, I'm here for you. I want to do it for you. This is how that works. And another thing I want to point out that with what you said is when we empathize, validating someone's feelings doesn't mean that you agree with what they're saying. And I think that's so important. People get lost in this, especially when they have conflict within family. Just because you forgive someone doesn't mean you're forgetting it. It doesn't mean you condone it. And it's a big piece that a lot of, you mentioned therapy early on, a lot of therapists talk about that when it comes to trauma, when it comes to different things that come up, you can let go of something that happened. And it doesn't mean that you condone it. It means that you're freeing yourself. I'm not going to give, rent-free space in my head to that situation or to that individual, whatever it might be. So I think it's important that people should take away from this also is that empathy and validation doesn't mean you agree with what it is that they're saying, but you can still give them space for their feelings, because it's not about facts on the ground, what's going to happen. It's about them and their feelings in the moment.
And it's amazing how once you hear someone out and you give that space for them to express their feelings, the whole dynamic changes. And they are then much more open to hear your perspective and to come to some kind of agreement. I would also just reinforce what you said before about the word but. But is a terrible word. Avoid it whenever possible. It's very defensive. It's inherently negative. So just use a period and start a new sentence and drop that but. And I would also add that emojis can play a big role here. A lot of people make fun of emojis, and I'm not a huge emoji user myself. Like, I'm not the kind of person who has 7 exclamation points in their email and 3 smiley faces in a row. But a little emoji here and there, strategically placed, can really change the tone of written communication and can convey the warmth that you're trying to convey. So something to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, and it's amazing how that little smiley at the end shows them like this is the tone you should read this in, right? Because email, like that's one of the worst parts about, in my mind, email. I'm a big extrovert in a certain degree, but I shy away from email just because I feel like it's so non-conversational in that way. But like even with DMs, like a simple like little smiley face at the end is like this is the tone you should read this in, not like I'm all angry at you. And the amount of miscommunication blowups that happen without that little piece are huge. One of the things I'll go back to also on something that you just said is a lot of, when we're having those backs and forths is how we're asking questions, how we're gaining information when someone says things, right? So a great example of that is when someone says, oh, I hate, I hate the design or I hate the copy, right? And getting into a conversation where you can simply ask, a very specific question that points on that, and all of a sudden they go, oh no, I don't really hate it, I just don't like this piece, right? So it's important also when asking questions to understand what is it that they're really saying and what are they not saying.
Absolutely. It's really just helping them draw out the nuggets of their feedback. So they have a vibe that they don't like it. And you, as the professional, are responsible to help them break it down and figure it out. What is it that's bothering them? And sometimes just asking that question directly. Say, can you share a little bit more specifics about what's bothering you? Is it the color? Is it the shape of the font? Like, give them some options and help them figure out, because sometimes they don't know it themselves and they need your support there.
Right. And it boils down to, using labels, right? It seems like blank, right? Not talking about, the situation itself, but it seems like, or this way you're not blaming them in any way, shape, or form, but, that'll really help in bringing that out. When we talk about, uncomfortable situations, a lot of times it could boil down to unreasonable or unachievable demands. What steps do you take to manage expectations when clients are concerned?
So going back to what I said before, prevention is really your best option here. The more you can give clients a very clear sense of what to expect when working with you, the more you'll prevent these demands. So maybe that's a very clear agreement. I know professionals who send out a little handbook at the beginning of a project where they just go through the different stages of the project and have a couple, 4 or 5 bullet points for each stage, letting the client know what to expect. I know professionals who send out a cheat sheet before they present a deliverable, and the cheat sheet shows the client what kind of feedback is helpful and constructive, and basically teaches the client how to give good, useful feedback, and gives examples of feedback that's not useful, like "I hate it," and feedback that is useful, and really just educating and hand-holding the client that way. That can go so far. In terms of dealing with clients who are unreasonable, a lot of times you just have to repeat yourself. So sometimes I'll give one of my students or alumni advice, and I'll say, so tell them, sure, I'll be happy to do that for you. That's an add-on. So they say, oh, but what if the client pressures me to do it anyway? So I say, repeat yourself. Just keep saying what you will and won't do in a nice, friendly, warm way until they realize that these are their options. So very important to stay professional, keep the emotion out of it, even if you feel like they're squeezing you and you're so resentful and you feel like they're draining you and stressing you out and it's affecting your personal life. You don't have to share that with them. Talk about that with your friend or your therapist or your partner, or your spouse. But with the client, just be very factual. Here's what I am happy to do. Here's what I can't do. How would you like to move forward?
Yeah, and it's those strong boundaries of just saying things again and again. It's extremely impactful because, you know, again, going back to the example we gave earlier, when it comes to, therapists, a lot of times they tell people this when it comes to certain situations they'll find themselves in, is just say it again. Right? If someone's not understanding you, you don't need to explain it. It's not a problem of them understanding what you're saying. They don't want to accept what you're saying. So if you just stand your ground that this is the way it's going to be, so then at some point or another, they're going to give in, right? It can't keep going, right? You're not going to spend 20 minutes on the phone with them saying we want it and you saying we don't. We can't do that for you in that way. This is how we can do it. We want it. It's not going to go back and forth that many times, right? They're going to push and then they're going to realize at some point that, okay, this is just ridiculous and I can't push like this. They're obviously strong. And one of the biggest pieces for freelancers is that people, because they are a freelancer, people, unfortunately, and it's wrong, they think they can take advantage of them. They think, oh, they don't have this big business and therefore they don't really know what they're doing. They're new. I'll be able to get a little bit more, or let me just ask them this. And I asked, they could have said no. But the piece they don't necessarily realize is that it's very hard for freelancers to say no in those situations. But the stronger you can be as a freelancer, as a small business owner, and the stronger you can stick to your red lines, the better off people will look at you. Number one, they will respect you so much more for sticking to it than giving in to them. And number two, they will be much more willing to go with what you're saying and trust you more as time goes on.
So well put. I once heard a statement from Josh Garofalo, who's an amazing copywriter and product marketer. He said something so smart. He said the freelancers who are able to set boundaries are the ones who don't believe that this client is going to be their last. When you are confident that there's a whole lot of amazing clients out there, and worst case scenario, this client is going to drop you, then you're able to stick with boundaries that are healthy and that feel right for you without constantly worrying, because that's really what's holding a lot of freelancers back from being clear about their needs. They're just worried that this project is going to fall through. And that takes us back to what I mentioned before, is that if you don't have good marketing set up and you don't have good lead gen, you're going to be in a very vulnerable position. That said, with all this talk about boundaries and red lines and sticking to your guns and being firm, I'm a huge believer in charging enough that you can be flexible when you want to be. And maybe that means extending the project for a week or two because the client was super busy, or maybe that means throwing in a small thing. As long as you do it intentionally and you communicate that to your client and you say, this was not included in the project, but it's been so great to work with you so far, I'm happy to throw this in. Or really the end date was May 30th, but I'd like to give you that space and we're going to extend it another 2 weeks or whatever it is. If you can do that to a degree, then that makes the client feel really supported. And that's why I really recommend having enough of a profit margin that you can have that wiggle room.
That's absolutely fantastic. I really like that. Could you share an example of a situation where you turned something that was really tense into a positive outcome?
So I had a wonderful client with whom I had worked on a website together before I had a team, back when it was just me, one-man band, or one-woman band, I should say. And we had a great working relationship. After the website project, I continued to work for him, and we tried working together in a different capacity where I was doing some social media management for him. And it wasn't going as smoothly as the website project had gone. I found that communication wasn't going so well. It was taking him time to get back to me with feedback. Some of the ideas or the posts that I had sent were not what he had in mind. And at one point I sent an email. At one point he received an invoice for the service, and he sent back a very distressed email saying, I don't think the service is going as expected. Why am I getting this invoice now? I thought I was going to be billed after 3 months. We need to work this out. And I remember feeling such a pit in my stomach, because it's always awful to get that kind of email from any client, but especially from a client with whom you've had a really great relationship until then. And I wrote back with a very empathetic email, and I was very genuine. And I said, let's say his name was John. I said, John, I'm really sorry. It sounds like you are not happy with how this project is going. And that's something that I want to talk about. I want to resolve, because it's really important to me that you especially feel great about the work that we're doing together. And then I went through some technical points of where I feel some of the miscommunications had happened. And I ended off the email. Before I ended off the email, I knew that John was going through some personal hardship at that point in his life. And I suspected that that was part of where this was coming from, and was also part of why he hadn't been so communicative. And so I wrote in the email, I said, we had agreed on this 3-month engagement or whatever it was. It sounds like you're going through a lot right now. Would you like to pause the engagement and pick it up when things settle down on your end? And then I ended off by saying, how about we talk about this? Are you available at 2 p.m. tomorrow? So again, I was going toward the phone call, but I still showed a lot of empathy in that email. And I tried to show that flexibility. I didn't have to offer to put the project on pause, but I knew that he was probably just juggling too much, and it wouldn't be strategic for me or him to continue. So I wasn't going to just let go completely, because he had signed on the agreement. And I wasn't going to say, okay, you're not happy, you don't have to pay me. That wasn't happening, but coming towards him by giving that flexibility. And he responded like within minutes and said something like, Michal, this is why I love working with you. Thank you so much for your understanding. Yes, let's talk tomorrow at 2 p.m. I know I haven't been the greatest client. Let's talk it over. Like he literally said those words. So it was like once I conveyed that empathy and gave him that wiggle room and space, he was able to acknowledge that he hadn't been the greatest partner in this relationship. And we had a very productive phone call, and the rest of the engagement went very smoothly. So I think that what worked in that email correspondence was, number one, that I truly empathized and that I cared. And number two, I showed that flexibility on my end. And number three, just tried to get on a call as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and it's interesting because another thing that you did there is you put him before you, in the sense that the feeling you were trying to give over to him in that communication is that I understand there's something going on in your world that I want to put first. Right? As opposed to, I want to put myself first and I really want to get this done and I really want to, finish this. And we said that we were going to do it like this and you're not communicating. You put his whole situation first, right? You were service first, me second, right? You were giving as opposed to taking from the situation, right? You were much more willing to say, like you said, you were flexible and there were other, pieces within, the puzzle that really made it come together. But I think one of the, a big piece that, where he came back to say, this is why I love working with you, was like you said, that empathy of saying, I can do these things to show John that I'm going to put him first in the situation. And I really want to just figure it out because we've been great partners in the past. Something must be going on. Let's try to figure it out together. So it was even we could call it the negotiation, the figuring things out. It was all about what was the values that you were putting on it. What were I trying to go with it? What was that pedestal I was putting it on? It was, I want to make this work. And obviously something's going on. Let's try to figure it out together.
Yeah, very collaborative approach.
Yeah. When you're in a situation like that, it could have been so easy for you to not stay in a positive or professional, mindset. How did you, or how does a person stay in that positive professional mindset, even when they are dealing with a difficult situation or a difficult client, which is really two separate questions potentially?
Yeah, so the first is going to sound a little bit superficial, but just remind yourself, you are the professional. Like this is on you. It's your job. Yes, we want reasonable clients who are respectful and professional, but at the end of the day, you have a reputation to maintain. This is not your first client and it's not going to be your last. So just for your own sake, stay professional and keep that communication very respectful. That's like on a logical level. On an emotional level, allow yourself to feel the feelings, those negative feelings. Just don't brush over them. Don't pretend they don't exist. If you're feeling hurt or rejected because you got scathing feedback from a client, or if you're feeling deeply resentful because of something a client said or did, let yourself feel those feelings, articulate them, talk them over with a friend, sit with them for a little bit, allow yourself to process those feelings, and then you'll be in a better position to communicate with the client from a place of greater clarity and rationality. And that brings me to my next point, which is always give yourself some time. If you're feeling really angry or really emotional, don't respond and wait. And even with a call, you might want to wait a day or wait till the next day to get on a call.
Yeah, a lot of times in any situation, not just with clients, but in any personal situation, something happens and we get that flight or fight response right away. And our blood, just boils. We go into this, situation where our adrenaline is just through the roof. And the worst thing you can do is get on the phone right away with a client at that moment, right? You want to give yourself time to experience other things in life and let yourself calm down from the situation, as well as, like you said, I think that's one add-on, I would say. But even more so, I think it's so important, the idea of giving ourselves permission, like you just did, for us, giving permission to ourselves of normalizing the fact that the way we feel is okay, right? There's nothing wrong with the way you feel, and it doesn't make you bad, right? You're allowed to have negative feelings, but don't ignore them because then they fester and then they become much bigger problems down the road. But when you have those feelings, going through that process of understanding what's going on, why do you feel that way? What part of you is feeling a certain way? How can you help, move that aside and really deal with it as opposed to ignoring it? But simultaneously, I think, even adding to that is, like you said, I love, that line, you are the professional, right? When you see yourself in a certain way, you are blank, whatever it is, right? Just like, many times, you are the son, people who are, they're children of very rich people. They hold themselves in an aristocratic way. They just act in a certain way that's different. Okay, nowadays might be a little bit different where they feel like they could just do whatever they want, but once upon a time, at least it was that way. And when you remind yourself that that's who you are, then it's beneath you to a certain degree to go down this road of being petty and, not being professional. Right? I think that's a piece of it as well.
Yeah, agreed.
This one's a bit of an interesting question, so I hope you forgive me for this. What is perhaps a personal story about a time with a client that things didn't go as planned, and what did you learn from that experience?
So I think I shared a personal story just before, but I can give another shorter story of an example with a client where we worked together on a couple of projects with a very successful outcome. And then the client had a larger project, and we decided to work on the larger project in a slightly different way with a different engagement structure. And about 30% of the way through, I realized this was not going well. And what I discovered through a very collaborative process that involves a Zoom call and clear, respectful communication with the client was that with this particular client, we needed to go back to the original engagement structure. They needed a certain level of collaboration and back and forth and a certain number of calls that the current structure was not providing. And it reminded me that you can have a great client with whom you have a great relationship, but it has to be the right structure for that kind of client. And different clients need different things. So something to keep in mind, especially if you have set packages, which is great. I'm a huge fan of that. But being conscious of the fact that not every package will work with every client. And even if you worked successfully in the past in one way, it may not translate well to another way.
Yeah, and the nuance of where my question was coming from is this was, the idea of something that didn't end up working out as well. And it's a perfect example because ultimately in this situation, you did have to take that step back, right? It didn't, and what you learned from it was that communication piece that every client's going to be different, right? We like to systemize everything. And ultimately that's important, but many times there are rules are meant to be broken, right? So remember in that systemization, as we are, growing our businesses and we want to make things more automated or more systematized, there's going to be times where you need to take that step back and say, is this working for this particular client? Maybe this client needs a different approach, something, and like in this case scenario, you took that step back and said, well, we used to have something else that worked much better. Let's try that again. And then, it was much better from there.
Yeah, well, actually, in this approach, I offered the client two options. I offered them to revert back to that other engagement structure or to take a pause and just end the project where it was right there. And they can do some other internal work and then come back to me and decide. And they chose the latter one. And we parted very amicably. And I hope to continue to work with them in the future. But it was the right thing at that point to end it before things soured and became worse.
Yeah, for sure. Um, what would you say is the number one piece of advice for professionals struggling to manage clients?
So I think my number one piece of advice, maybe can I have a pre number one and then a number
Go
one?
for it.
Okay. So the pre number one is you need to filter your clients well. You need to have a good sales process that allows you to spot all these red flags and allows you to better qualify who you're going to work with and who you are not. And there are so many ways to filter clients, starting with your social media posts and your website messaging. That alone can prevent loads of low quality clients from even reaching out to you. So that's step number one. If you find yourself dealing with a lot of difficult clients, there's a good chance that you're just not filtering them well, and there's something wrong in your sales process. My second point would be that if you consistently find yourself struggling to manage clients, you may need to work with a mindset coach or just a general business coach, especially if you are a people-pleasing type and you struggle with creating boundaries. There may be some deeper issues that you need to work out, which can probably benefit all of your relationships. So that's one point about like the mindset. And thirdly, related to this is that if you're constantly dealing with client struggles, there's a good chance there's something wrong with your process. Maybe you are not giving clients a good enough sense of what the stages are going to look like. Maybe you are not giving them enough structure and enough guidance in how to give you constructive feedback. Maybe you are not communicating clearly enough. Maybe you are not presenting your work live or with a video in a way that showcases the strategy and shows how much thought and how valuable the piece is. There's so many things that it could be, but if you are constantly dealing with client struggles, then you should really evaluate your process, see where things get a little bit rocky, and see if there's something you can do to improve your process fundamentally from the ground up.
Wow. Absolutely love that. Really, really deep. And I think that it really goes to the core of what we're trying to do, right? Because ultimately, everything that we do is funneling people towards using our service. And if we're not clear on who the type of person that we want to work with is, then our messaging is going to reflect that. The website's going to reflect that. Everything that we put out is going to reflect that. And then all of a sudden, it's going to filter into us having quite a number of situations that are uncomfortable. So I think that's absolutely fantastic. I'd like to open the floor for anybody who has any questions. You can put in the chat for anybody who doesn't want to open their mic or their video. I'm happy to, voice your questions for you. But you could put in, what are you stuck on today? What's a question that you have for us, specific to the conversation that we've been having, something that came up, or even just asking if you can ask one question on the topic today, what would that be? We'll give a minute for people to go ahead and do that.
Sure. Or if you recently had a difficult client situation, or if you find a common client situation coming up that you're not sure how to handle, happy to talk about that.
Yeah, definitely. So I have one here about people who are more introverted. Okay, so this one's interesting. So this person saying they find themselves to be more introverted, and therefore, you had mentioned earlier the idea of hiding behind a screen. They're very uncomfortable to begin with the phone, and they're not really sure how they could find themselves in an uncomfortable situation, which is even worse as they are introverted. How could they deal with such a situation?
I think the only solution to that is practice. It's not going to be easy. And it's hard for extroverts, so it's going to be all the more harder for introverts. But at the same time, I would not recommend sticking to email, even if you're an introvert, because ultimately you'll end up having a lot more heartache and angst that way. So sometimes it's even a matter of role playing, like get a friend and practice the conversation, go through it a couple of times with a couple of different scenarios, and that'll enable you to get on the call with more confidence.
Yeah, I was going to mention role playing as well. And I think that one of the biggest pieces there is confidence, right? Building up your confidence to know, okay, these are the steps that I need to take in order to come out with a good outcome on this situation. So a lot of times just have your process clear. And there's a lot that could be taken away even just from this podcast in terms of what that process could look like. But understand, what is it that you want to get out of this conversation? What do you think could be the issues? And just go through what that conversation could look like within that role play. And from there, you should be able to come out with some of the pieces that could help you to get through it in the best way possible. And just make sure you have clarity on that. That clarity will give you confidence, which will give you an easier time, I think, with getting on the phone. Okay, we have another one here. I have a contact with good, fair limits, but some clients do not review it. A contract with good, fair limits, but some clients don't review it. I want to strike a good balance between being clear and not having a long call to review it. What do you suggest?
Great question. So I feel like this is a constant conflict in my mind between having a contract that's like legally airtight and a contract that's actually readable and understandable to normal humans. And I think depending on your industry and the nature of the service you provide and the price of the service you're providing, you may want to go one way or another. I'll give you an example. If you're charging $2,000 for some kind of small copywriting project, you don't need a legally airtight contract for that. It's overkill. The client is not going to read it. They're not going to understand it. And then they're going to be annoyed when you try to enforce the terms of the contract 2 weeks later. Instead, write out the terms as simply and concisely as possible. It could even be in an email, which they confirm their agreement on an email. But basically, the further and the more complex your project is, the further you would want to go in making that contract legally airtight. If you do need to have that kind of contract, which is a little bit more complex to protect yourself, but you don't want to have a long call to review it, I would recommend preparing a video walkthrough. It can be like 7 minutes, but just explaining to the client via video what each clause actually means. And you could even have like, I'm just thinking out loud, like you can have a separate document that's almost like a translation of the contract, and then just like summarizes what each clause means so that they can reference it and understand what they are signing on. That said, if there's a lot of money involved, then it may be worth one phone call to review it together and ask them live if they have any questions.
Yeah, I would also add, similar to like you said, having a cheat sheet, a lot of times you can have next to each of the paragraphs, kind of like a summary of what that paragraph is about. I know people that have told me they'll take a contract, they'll throw it into ChatGPT and say, can you please give me the English translation of what this really means, right? Summarize it for me. Do the same with your contract. And then you can just take those bullet points and put it next to each of those pieces. And it'll simplify it for your clients, and they'll be able to see, oh, this is where he talks about this. This is where we're talking about that. Okay, fine, great. Now they know. Um, Someone else asked here,
I
what
would
would be?
just one more thing I would add to that.
Go ahead.
It's also valuable to review your contract every so often and ask yourself, do I need this clause? Like sometimes we have clauses in our contract because that's what was in the template that we purchased or that our lawyer created for us 5 years ago, but we've
Right.
never enforced the clause. It's never been relevant. And it's just adding layers of complexity where it's not needed. So that's another thing to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. What would be the strategy if you're calling leads and you're not able to get a lead to answer the calls? Interesting. This is a good sales question. What would you do?
I'm not a big call person when it comes to sales. So
I
I'm
had a sinking
probably not
feeling
the
you'd
right
say that.
person. What?
I had a feeling you'd say that. Um, a lot of times when this comes up, when we're talking about having a strategy where you're trying to get through to someone, and again, this is very much dependent on whether or not you've had a relationship with them, you've spoken to them already. So I'm going to guess, just from the context of our conversation today, that you've already spoken to them and now they're kind of ghosting you to a certain degree. There are amazing templates from an email perspective to really be able to go through and help a client to come back to life. There's quite a number of things you could do from an marketing perspective. This conversation itself is not the right place for this. But I would very much encourage you, as we end the meeting, I'll be putting my own information there. You could feel free to schedule a call with me and I'll go more in depth in what are some of the strategies you can do for that. But sometimes it's simply a matter of being preemptive, making sure you're doing first touch points long before you ever have these types of things, encouraging them to not lead you to that situation. And when you do, doing things that are going to interrupt their patterns. Those are usually the best ways of getting around these types of situations, but it's more of a conversation for a different call. Someone else said, and this might be more up your alley, Mrs. Isaac, is same question as above, but follow up by email. If the lead/past client does not respond to the follow-ups, what can be a strategy to get a reply? How many follow-ups can be enough to stay in a good note and not cross the line?
Yeah, so what I like to do is have a basic formula like this that you can tweak. You have 2 emails that are just very friendly follow-ups. Hi, did you have a chance to review the proposal I sent last week? Hi, how's it going? What do you think about the proposal? 2 emails like that. Then I like to move on to an email that's what I call a concern email. So that's usually going to be like a week later, or maybe even a week and a half later, where it's like, hey, I haven't heard from you. Is everything okay? That's the whole email. And that's coming from a place of, I know you're not the kind of person to ghost me. So I'm sure there's something going on. Maybe you're really busy with your business, or maybe there's something going on in your personal life that doesn't allow you to get back to me. And very often clients will really respond to that email because they appreciate that, like, you're assuming the best, you're giving them the benefit of the doubt, and you're just wondering, like, honestly, is everything okay? And then after that, I would proceed to maybe 1 or 2 more emails that have a little bit more of that aggressive. I don't like to use the word aggressive because I'm not a big fan of being aggressive in general, but a little bit more of a firmer follow-up. So things like, hi, have you decided to defer the project? What you're basically saying is like, I'm not hearing from you, so I'm going to start assuming that this is no longer a priority for you. Is the project no longer a priority for you? Messaging like that, which reminds them of the fact that they initially showed a commitment to the project and they wanted to move forward to this project, and you're kind of saying, has something changed? And this goes very deep with the psychology of commitment. Humans are wired to want to see things through and to follow through on their commitments. So you're really playing on that. And then as a final follow-up, you can say something like, I'm going to assume this project is no longer a priority, period. Wishing you all the best. And that way you're closing up the project. And often that will trigger a reply. So I would say, depending on the kind of project and the relationship you have, my personal recommendation is not more than 4, max 5 emails.
Yeah, one of the things that, I mean, there's 2 different emails when it comes to people really not being responsive. One is one that uses a lot of Chris Voss verbiage, but Josh Braun takes it to another level. I'll lay this out really quickly. The subject line is just sorry. And this is, building off what you said, but it's kind of like the last 2 emails. I call the Chris Voss email like the nuclear version, and Josh Braun's is like one step before that. Hey, Linda, it looks like you decided to pass on X, which is not a problem at all. And I'll break down each sentence in and of itself, right? So the sorry is sorry for what? It piques their curiosity. They're going to want to open the email, see what's going on. That first line, it seems like you passed on X. It's not a problem. You've detached from the outcome. So the subconscious says there's no pressure whatsoever. The next line will be, I can only assume based on your initial interest, I messed something up along the way. Sorry about that. By taking responsibility, it's a great way to show you're putting their best interest first as opposed to your own, right? Next sentence will be, you're going to think this is a huge imposition, which is labeling a negative, and automatically it diffuses it. It's an accusation audit. That's straight out of the Chris Voss handbook, right? When you label a negative, it minimizes it. When you label a positive, it maximizes it. Would you be open to providing some feedback so I can get better the next time around? Was the price too high? Confusing demo, competing priorities, whatever, a couple different options you have. By giving them a menu, it makes it easier to answer, and just ending with a gracious and empathetic close. Either way, I know there's lots of stuff competing for your attention and your time. Thanks for giving X a look. That's it, right? And the beauty of this email is there's really no pressure on them. Right? You've completely taken the ball out of the court entirely. And now you're just asking for, if possible, what went wrong? Versus, the nuclear option, as I call it, the Chris Voss email, which is, have you decided to give up on X, right? Give up on the project. And the word give up is extremely important to that context because people don't like to give up. And when you use that specific verbiage, many times it'll elicit a response because of that. But yeah, I hope that this answered everyone's questions. I always like to end off each of the podcasts with a reminder. I definitely took a page of notes, and I always suggest take one thing from today and choose to implement that one thing. If we try to implement everything all at once, many times nothing's going to stick. Pick one thing, run with that. As time goes on, you could, of course, come back and do more. I wanted to hand the floor over to you, actually, Mrs. Eisik, because you had mentioned that you had an amazing offer for everyone that was here today.
Yeah,
Anyone listening?
sure. I have a client management cheat sheet that summarizes some of what we covered today, adds a little bit of new information. And if you'd like to access that cheat sheet, feel free to click on the link that Jakob just put in the chat, and you can grab that free cheat sheet. I forgot if it's 1 pages or 2 pages, but it can be really handy when you want to refresh your memory and figure out how to deal with a difficult situation.
Absolutely fantastic. And I encourage everyone to grab that. It's going to be really, really exciting. I would say as well, just in ending off in this live podcast, we'd like to speak about things that are timely, interesting, that you can add to your skill set toolbox. If you love this live podcast today, you could feel free to hit me up for a 30-minute strategy session to take your sales game to the next level. Just talk about anything that we spoke about here today. They do go quickly, so grab them while they last. And my contact information via WhatsApp is in there as well, in case you just want to skip straight to a quick question and see if we don't need to have a larger conversation. That's fine as well. It was absolutely fantastic having you on. This has been something that we've been working on for quite some time, so I'm really excited it really happened. And thank you very, very much for coming on. I really appreciate it, Ms. Eisik.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for being a great audience with great questions.
Likewise. Thank you very much. Take care, everyone. Until next time. Have a great
Bye-bye.
rest of your day.